Could you tell us your name and your age?
My name is Jeremy Brustein, and I'm 67 years old. Excuse me, I'm 66 years old. I'm rushing it along.
And you're a longtime political activist, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And when did you become politically active?
Well, at a pretty young age, because I'm the youngest in my family of my uh, siblings, and they were very active at a young political age. Um, given the tenor of the times in the 60s. So I certainly have memories, at least starting to 13 years old, of being very active.
And when did you first experience police violence?
Well, I mean, you're talking about done to me personally or just generally out there in society as a whole.
You, yourself.
The most extreme case was in 1981 when I was beaten in jail. We can get back to that. There were some cases not as extreme, but still, rather brutal. And that is when I was a student at Kent. I recall an incident of being thrown down on the ground and tackled by the police, as well as once when I was by myself going to a car at a parking lot. And this was actually a kind of a scary situation. A number of the cops who I knew in Kent through my activism, and they acted very belligerent and aggressive towards me verbally, saw me going to my car on my own, and they all just started running after me. I actually got into my car and was able to take off before they reached it. What would have happened if they had reached it without me taking off first, I don't know. But there are numbers of incidents like that.
Maybe you could tell us a little more, starting with the first one that you mentioned in 1981.
That was on Memorial Day. That's in the end of May, right? That's Memorial Day, and we had called for a protest against U.S. Wars and aggression overseas, Iran, and other ways in which the United States projects its death and murder to people. And there was a Memorial Day march by the Patriots with the military and all, and we decided that we would come in as a contingent at the end of that march, which, of course, when we did that, infuriated the people who were sponsoring the march, which was the city and their, official folks who were in the bandstand there. And the police had first moved to try and stop this contingent. But we were actually going through an area of downtown that overwhelmingly concentrated black shoppers. And they were very supportive. Many people were like encouraging and applauding. A number of people had actually joined in, which made it very difficult for them to move against us. And you can see their total frustration about that. And actually, if I remember correctly, and this is what I heard, because I'll tell you why I wasn't at the stands at the moment, and that is I think they actually had to end the whole thing and empty out the stands with their prominent people early. I had actually dropped back in order to sell a newspaper called the Revolutionary Worker Newspaper to the crowd. And as I was selling it, a cop, I really did not know it was a cop at the time because my back was to him. I was talking to somebody who had gotten the newspaper and engaged in a lot of conversation. Just grabbed me from behind and spun me around and uh, put me in handcuffs. Had me thrown into the car. He was a motorcycle cop, so there was some other cars he called. Had me thrown into a car, and as they were taking me to the jail for charges, I have no idea what the charges would be, given the fact that I had done nothing illegal. And they were threatening they were going to take me to a back alley and beat me up and doing all these kinds of threats that the cops do as a matter of course. And then when I got to the jail, with my hands handcuffed behind my back, and they were beginning to process me, the motorcycle cop came in and took out his billy club and started to beat me very severely. They beat me severely while all the other cops stood around, did nothing except the one cop who tried to stop him by saying, "Don't beat him, that's exactly what he wants you to do," which was absolutely insane. You're talking about this cop who eventually, within minutes, had broken and dislocated my thumb, had broken my jaw and some teeth in numerous places, my wisdom teeth, had created lacerations on my skull where eventually would need to be shaved and stitched there. Before I get to some of the medical things, they took me to a hospital, St. Vincent's, and I was talking to the different medical workers saying, "You cannot have me sent back to the jail. They beat me. They will continue to beat me." And of course, the medical, well, I shouldn't say of course, but none of them stepped up to try to play a role to say we need to admit this person, they can't go back, which they actually should have done. Because when I went back to jail, and then my comrades and relatives could not find me. They had to call up numerous places searching for where I was. They finally did. They got me out, and they brought me to another hospital. And the doctor in the emergency room there would not let me go home that evening. I wanted to go home. He said since my jaw was broken and my back tooth were broken, that the possibility of infection going through that break into the marrow, of the bone, and then causing severe complications was very real, and then I had to be admitted into the hospital that day. They had to do surgery on me, to wire my jaw shut, to put my hand in a cast, to shave and stitch up the lacerations on my scalp. And when I did get home after a couple of days in the hospital, where they needed to administer IV antibiotics too, in order to counter that possibility of infection, I got more than one phone call, I think exclusively from some black youth who mentioned that the hospital I was taken to always works hand in hand with the cops to cover up any of the brutality that they inflict on people, and that my case, where they didn't admit me, they just allowed me to go, and they didn't even identify my injuries, by the way. They said I did not have any severe injuries. Then when it actually came out in the newspaper that my jaw was broken, my hand was dislocated and broken, my scalp, all of this, they actually sent me a letter saying on second look at the x-rays that we took while in the hospital, we've concluded that in fact you do need immediate medical treatment. We suggest you go to a hospital. That was that was about 2 or 3 days after this had become public news, that hospital wanting to cover its ass evidently, and sent me that letter. So that's that story.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing. And then you were going to tell about some other times where you experienced police violence.
Well, at Kent, I was a student at Kent. I came in 2 years after the murders, so I was there at 72. The murders happened of the students in 1970. And Kent had built up what was considered, if I remember correctly, the most developed and advanced campus police force of any in the country, and they were a model. And what they were a model of was to repress and put down the protests that were really just spreading like wildfires, had spread for quite a few years before I ended up at Kent, like wildfires through campuses around the country. So they were an example, and what they were an example of was definitely their brutality and aggression. It's not like I can remember every incident, but I certainly remember things like I mentioned, being thrown to the ground, being sat upon on the ground, being threatened with physical violence, and just generally trying to terrorize was very much part of their, stock and trade. And, there was a certain a kind of a message that they sent in many ways that there are no lines by which they're going to remain behind in terms of legalities and policies. That if they had that opportunity, like that story I was telling you, to mess you up, no matter how much you might say, oh, this is illegal and this shouldn't be done, while they have the power, you don't, and they will, and they did try to terrorize you in that kind of a way.
Okay, so we've gone from 81 back to 72-ish. Were there any other times that you experienced police violence in Cleveland?
Well, yeah. I mean, definitely on the protests after a number of the like Michael Brown and a number of the police murders, when the protests really started to escalate. There was a young black man who was grabbed by the cops at one of the protests. He was not outside the protest. This was right in the center of the protest, and I ran up to defend him, and I was grabbed. I had some sort of extremely painful repellent sprayed directly into my eyes. My arms bent behind my back in a very painful position. And when we were, me and this other young man brought to the a parking lot, the underground parking lot of the police station, where they had us get out of the car. The young man was his plastic handcuffs were on so tight, and they were in such an uncomfortable position, and he was just asking to please either loosen it or put him in another position. He was being completely ignored. And then when I mentioned to a cop, can't you just do something for this young man? He's clearly in pain, and look at his hands. His hands were red and they were getting swollen. The palms were getting red. His hands were getting swollen. He was in terrible discomfort. And the cop basically told me if I opened my mouth again to say anything, that he would put me on the ground in a way that I wouldn't be able to get back up. That's exactly what he said. So, that was certainly one of those incidents that, really characterize how the cops handle situations in the way that they treat people.
Any other particular instances where you yourself have experienced police violence in Cleveland? Or do you feel like you were ever targeted for arrest in Cleveland, where you weren't necessarily beaten, but you were, you experienced that kind of repression?
Early in the discussion, I was thinking of another incident of having experienced violence. I'll see if I can't recall it as I talk. There was another experience in terms of, yes, I certainly feel like I've been targeted a number of times. Once, and this was actually back in 1980 in Cleveland, at a high school, where we were building for Revolutionary May Day, and the students were polarized. There was, a lot of support and people taking up the red flags, and then there was the section of very reactionary students, the same kind of people who you would identify today as Trump supporters and those kinds of fascist social base. They tried to threaten us physically, but we weren't having it, and we stood our ground and really tried to draw forward the students that were very supportive, as there was. And then, at the end of the day, we went to our cars, followed by some of these reactionaries. And when I was in the car, they started to actually run towards the car. And so I, started driving off. any kind of extreme fashion, but my doors was closed. I was trying to drive off, and at that point, the cop was running up to me. Either he was kind of driving or running. I don't remember, but I had to slam on my brakes very quickly, and I was pulled out of the car, and I was arrested again for reasons I have no idea. And in fact, in that case, I was eventually just released. But I wasn't released until they first actually charged me and showed me the charge of attempted murder of a police officer. That's what they said I was doing, was trying to use the car as a weapon. And again, it's those things where they really try kind of like intimidate, and frighten and stuff. Attempted murder of a police officer, that was absolutely insane. Especially if you think about that they went from attempted murder of a police officer to having released me because they had absolutely nothing that they could, realistically charge me with. It really exposes, their method of how they go about, with their ugly, ways of policing, and intimidating and threatening and so forth. One thing I did want to add about the time that I was beaten, talking about the court case itself, and that is what I was eventually arrested for. When this is when they actually had handcuffed me and beaten me, sent me to the hospital, was resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, which again is absolutely ridiculous. We actually had video of me just standing there selling the newspaper and the cop coming and grabbing me. So there was a trial, and the trial found me innocent of resisting arrest, but guilty of assaulting a police officer. So my attorney went to speak to the jury, because how can you not be resisting arrest while you're assaulting a police officer, right? How could, there wasn't the logic to this sentence. And really, I'd have to say, to the discredit of the better people on the jury who did not do what they should have done, they told my attorney that it was a hung jury, and instead of constantly going back and saying that it's a hung jury, they decided to split the verdict, one guilty and one innocent, rather than stick with the fact that numbers of jurors found me innocent, completely. One of the reasons that I was really able to, expose in the courtroom too, and win numbers of jurors over, is that the fact that I was beaten had gotten out, which the prosecution tried to repress, and actually in a legal way did repress, because the way we handled that is that there was this young white man. He must have been he was a teenager, and he was there for drugs, and he saw me being beaten, and I gave me his name, and I went to visit him, and he said he couldn't testify because there was a warrant out. He was on probation for not going to his parole officer, and he showed up actually on the day of my trial and said he couldn't live with himself if he didn't step forward to testify to this. And my attorney said, well, since you're not on the witness list, when you sit on that stand and I ask you, what did you witness? And you said, I saw Jeremy being beaten by the cops, the prosecution will immediately object, and the judge will uphold the objection, because it is actually kind of outside of the procedure, since you hadn't come forward earlier for us to be able to do this, but the jury would have heard it. And that is exactly what happened. And then soon as the judge called for the attorneys to step up to the bench to discuss it, and coming to the conclusion that it would be dismissed, the young man split and then was kind of out of reach once again. So that's how that was handled.
Oh, wow, that's great. Okay, so any other instances where you experienced police violence?
Well, me and hundreds of other people, like in the aftermath of George Floyd, I was downtown, and the police were very violent. They, with their, I don't know the names of all the particular things they used, aren't they called like stun grenades or flash grenades or bombs or these kinds of things, right? Some of them are smoke, some of them are incredibly loud. They were shooting things like rubber bullets. You know, again, all the technical aspects of what was the weaponry they used, I'm not sure, but there was a whole variety of them, and they really let loose with it. And you know, I actually knew a person who was a vice principal at a high school who had come down with her daughter, and they were both white, and she was a person who was outraged by what happened to George Floyd, but hadn't really been in protests. And she said, I went so confident that this will be a protest. People will be stating, you know, their outrage over this police murder, and we'll have a protest. She said, I came to that protest having a fair amount of trust and confidence in the police following the law and handling things, you know, pretty much reasonably. She goes, after she saw the violence, after she saw police consciously aiming their guns, you know, with the rubber bullets and all, and shooting, including youth, including very young youth, and all the ways that they, you know, escalated this situation with their violence. She said she could never ever trust the police again. It was that kind of transformation that I had witnessed, but had seen over a lifetime, and was not shocked. But for people who were unfamiliar with that level of violence, you know, that shock would led to an experience like that of somebody, and I'm sure she wasn't the only one, completely changing any positive experience they might have had for the police, to losing that and having none at all because of that incident.
Do you have any other times where you've witnessed violence from the Cleveland police that you can recall on other of others?
Well, the situation that I just mentioned, of course,
Right.
and you know, it isn't like I can remember the details, but the whole period, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and all the various murders, and then a constantly more and more massive protests out on the streets and stuff. There were certainly incidents where people were grabbed and really, you know, handled in a very brutish kind of way. But it became just part of a little bit like what the scenery was in terms of how the police treated things, and what the people had to resist and stand up against. But it isn't like I can recall like that, like, you know, particular incidents other than the things that I was talking about.
Were you at the demonstration after Michael Brelow was let off, that was kettled in 2015?
Yes, but actually, I was not one of the people kettled because I was already in jail. That was the protest where I had run up to try to defend this young black man who was grabbed because they had grabbed him. That was closer to like the Free Stamp, which is not where folks were kettled, but that was a little bit further west and east, excuse me. And I had heard about it. Being in jail, I certainly heard about it, but I wasn't there. And I did hear, you know, and I was given examples of not just how people were grabbed and handled in the kinds of ways I'm describing, but also the conditions in jail. They were sent to they were sent to an old shut down kind of warehouse. I forgot what it was being used for.
Was it the workhouse?
Maybe, but this
maybe
was a
not.
shut down place that was in horrible condition. The water, the people just described it to me. I don't remember all the details, but it was like vermins and varmints or whatever. You know what I mean? Like roaches and I don't think they had fresh water there, and I don't think they had blankets or anything for people to lay down on. It was clearly bringing people to awful conditions is just kind of part of the message they were trying to drive home to folks.
I wonder if if you think about it for a second, if you've noticed any particular changes in the police tactics over the long years that you've been a political activist.
Well, I can't say that. I can say that I've seen it rise and fall depending on what was going on overall. If there was larger, massive protests of people, and sometimes actually that's responded to with a little bit of standoffish to see if that would peter out. Sometimes it's responded to, by going straight at it in an aggressive way. So, there's a certain amount of play there in terms of how they tried to handle things at certain times. I know that after Michael Brown, actually, when we sat down in the streets, the cops first moved forward to try and stop that, but then backed off just because of the numbers of people. But they got their orientation the next day, in which case that's when I was arrested on a different arrest than what I've been mentioning. And that was specifically focusing on me because I was the first person to kind of sit down during that day before, and the same cop that approached me and then felt driven back by so many people identified me immediately and grabbed me. But then it was decided not to arrest anybody else. But then in protests afterwards, there were numbers of arrests, and sometimes very brutal. So you have this kind of ebb and flow, and I think they tried to play it in terms of how best to bring this to an end, right? Because for them, protests around anything that is just is unjust in their view, but how to handle that and smash it, might be more letting it go and see if the steam runs out, or let's actually repress it and arrest it. And I've certainly seen both, but I've seen it ebb and flow over a whole period of time.
I feel like tear gas used to be what we could expect.
Uh-huh.
Whereas nowadays they have all these flashbangs and, I'm not sure they were rubber bullets, but, these other kinds of grenade weapons
Right.
and things. So I think that's sort of a different escalation. And maybe I don't know if it has to do with some of the things that were given from the military. Remember, there was funding
Yes.
for local police departments to be
Yeah.
able to buy weaponry from.
That's a very good point. And which also reminded me of something I'll bring up in a second, but I think that's absolutely correct. When I do think back, I think an escalation is tear gas. I don't really remember anything but tear gas. There are times there are more. Quite frankly, as we talk, I remember things. I was brought to the hospital because I went to the hospital because a cop, when we were protesting the Klan in Columbus, Ohio, smashed me on the back of the head. I didn't even see him come up behind me with a billy club. And again, I needed stitches. I went to the hospital then, so there was that kind of violence along with tear gas. But you're right. There was that whole move to militarize the police and send a tremendous amount of military armaments, including their vehicles and their weapons and stuff, which have been brought into play. And one thing I didn't say is that I actually went to Ferguson right soon as the uprising started in the aftermath of the murder of Michael Brown. And so I was there when the National Guard was there. So there was the National Guard and the police, with all their, big weaponry and all their snipers on the rooftops and things like that. During the period that I was there, which was about 2 or 3 days after, the struggle against that was really unleashed because of Michael Brown's murder. It isn't like I witnessed any actual confrontation, but I witnessed people being surrounded as if they're like an enemy village, by the military, prepared to bring down, the most horrific violence, and certainly showing everybody that. And so that was a very clear message that you can see there when I was in Ferguson.
So is there anything else you'd like to say about police violence in Cleveland?
Only that I don't think we'll ever put an end to this kind of treatment of people. short of making a revolution and getting to a whole different system. You know, when I was in jail after the Michael Brown protest here, there was a black prison officer, a jailer, whatever you call them. The people there make sure you're not going to escape. Came up to me, and I wasn't in the mood for a conversation, but he said, well, it's not like I don't understand what you're talking about. And the way he explained that, he goes, I was in the locker room after they murdered Melissa and Timothy. And for people who don't know, almost an entire police department came out to chase this black couple who were unarmed, and they jumped on the car after the car smashed into, I think, a wall or something. I don't quite remember, but in any case, the car came to a stop. They jumped on it and just shot endless numbers of bullets in killing them. And so this one black prison guard was saying, well, I was in the locker room when they all came back from that. He goes, they were all high-fiving themselves and acting like they had just come back from a football game where their favorite team had won. He goes, that's how they were acting. And he was telling me this to try to kind of, you know, express the fact that, oh, I understand some of what you're talking about. His conclusion was, though, that, of course, you know, protests and stuff isn't going to do anything. You know, you have to kind of like, you know, work through the channels and all this kind of other thing, which isn't going to do anything whatsoever. To get back to what I was saying earlier, I do firmly believe you will need a revolution to bring forward a whole new system, because if you have a system by its very nature, creates so much inequality, which it does, between rich and poor, and between black and white, and immigrants and non-immigrants, then you need a system that justifies that and maintains it. And their justification is that the people down at the bottom are just animals of the night, and they're dangerous, and that we need to bring brutality down on them in order to protect others. And so they both bring you know, their physical force in order to keep people in their place, and justify it by putting forward a whole ideology of inferiority, and they're criminals, and they'll do danger to you, and all this is a justification. If the very nature of the way a system functions creates this horrible polarization, all the other stuff has to go with it in order to maintain it, in terms of police keeping people on the bottom and a whole, you know, ideology that justifies it. You're going to have a whole different system, which could only be brought about by revolution, where the people's police would actually, as Bob Avakian says, be willing to give their own life before they wantonly shoot somebody else down. And this is what I firmly believe in, and this is what I work for.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.